could have walked past the painting and never seen her. Instead, he stopped, thumbing the rim of his wineglass as if the motion bought him a better look at the strokes. Short, ferocious sweeps of cerulean that refused to sit where expectation said they should. Viven Harper Hartwell was kneeling on the floor, knees smudged with paint, lips pressed into the small, concentrated expression every maker knows. A drop of blue lay on the back of her hand, as vivid and stubborn as a secret. He smiled, the sort of smile that had been trained on boardroom tables and charity galas, and for a breath it unsettled her. He smelled of winter cologne and an arrogance she had learned to read with the same steady attention she used on her canvases. When he introduced himself, Derek Ashford, heir to Sterling Pharmaceuticals, he offered his name as if it were currency. She offered hers as if it were nothing at all. They met, like most honest things do, in a silence. He admired the painting without the standard voyeuristic compliments. He asked only how she had gotten the layers of blue to catch the light the way they did. It was the kind of question that made her articulate the small craft of it, and talking craft is an intimacy Viven always accepted. She told him about the pigment she ground herself, about a childhood stain of sky on her palms, little confessions that are not the same as promises. He told her about a laboratory in New Jersey, about his father's insistence on conservative financials, about the difficulty of translating a scientist's mind into a board's language. Neither mentioned who they were meant to be in the world beyond the gallery's blank walls. There was a gravity in Derek's hand when he touched the edge of her frame, a polite reverence that didn't know the weight of the crown tucked into Viven's small safety deposit box half a continent away. She had not told him. She had not told anyone in the quiet life she'd built. The narrow apartment with the sagging radiator that she liked because it kept the paint at the right temperature in winter. The evening classes she taught to teenagers who had better things to be than bored. The modest stipend she took from the family trust each year, and the enormous sums she moved only through the legal architecture of her private office. She had reasons. The title in her passport read, Her Royal Highness Princess Vivian of Erwin, a line of ink she kept like a bruise, visible only if someone insisted on dragging the truth into light. Erwin existed on the map of stories and careful diplomats' notes, a small monarchy with more ceremony than geopolitics. Its people expected measured benefaction rather than autocratic command. Viven had been raised in a lot of gilded rooms and taught to carry her lineage as a soft garment, not a suit of armor. She had watched as the world measured her worth against it, and she had learned to prefer the honest friction of anonymity. She had chosen, deliberately, to see whether she could love without the halo of title and the quiet deference that sometimes mistook itself for affection. Derek bought her coffee more often than not. He would track her down at the little bakery with the chipped counter. He would debate her over the merits of olive oil and cake. Their early months were a modest, hungry set of days. Him asking questions about how she painted light, her asking about the way his silence showed where he was nervous. He told her he hated insincerity. She told him about the students who traded flattery for grades, and how she refused to swallow falsehoods on principle. When the family first met her, they did so as people accustomed to inventory. Derek Ashford, the matriarch, moved like someone arranging a room. She had the softest gloves and the sharpest eyes. Catherine and Richard sent the kind of compliments that were actually investigations. Gabriella skated along the surface of conversation, thin and bright, with the occasional sting of a compliment that landed like a tally. Trevor, who handled deals for the company, watched Viven as if assessing whether her silence made her a risk or an asset. They were all polite in the way people are polite to objects they plan to appraise. They treated her gentleness as a thing to be catalogued, useful in a spouse, priceless in a philanthropic portfolio. The first Sunday dinner at the Ashford house was an exercise in measured warmth. Viven sat with her hands in her lap and listened to jokes that were rehearsed as if in membership, and ate food plated with the precision of people who ate to show discipline. She answered when invited, smiled when that would suffice, and left with her wrist marked by the faint ache of having kept herself small for an evening. Some nights afterward, in the dim safety of her studio, the smallness settled differently. The paint on her fingers stained her skin like a memory. She found herself speaking the truth into the darkness, about insignificance, about the ache of being seen as tender, pitiable or flattering instead of being regarded as a person who could say no. She loved Derek with an honesty that surprised her. He was unassuming in small ways and deferential in larger ones, the kind of man who would open a door and apologize for the weather. She loved him, quietly, for the things that did not look like inheritance or privilege. She also signed a prenup. It was the sort of conversation you keep in your back pocket when you love in countries where legacy means ledger lines. Derek's father insisted. A family lawyer drafted something that looked like a brick of paper, thick with clauses intended to plaster over the more uncomfortable questions. The document delineated premarital property, enumerating family trusts and foreign holdings and assets specially designated as non-marital. It required transparency for gifts and inheritance during the marriage, and set out the mechanisms for adjudicating any dispute. A joint arbitrator selected from a list of elder statesmen, an agreed-upon jurisdiction, and a sealable confidentiality clause to keep the family's business from becoming gossip. Viven read it twice, then a third time. The clause that mattered to her, perhaps more than any other, was plain and surgical. Assets deemed personal before the marriage would remain hers, held in trust and insulated from marital claim, on condition that they be declared to the attorney and placed under a blind trustee should either party request dissolution. It was a clause about quietness, about preserving the separate histories of lives that chose to intersect, instead of dissolving them into a new ledger. She signed. When her signature dampened the paper, the way the ink bloomed into the fibers felt like a small theft. She had signed not to hide anything from Derek. She trusted him, but to save herself from becoming a story. She had not told him about the trust, nor about the titular letters folded away in a bank far from both of them. She had wanted, at some stubborn, naive level, to be loved for the way she mixed color, for the way she could hold a child's attention through the shape of a brushstroke. There is a kind of cruelty in looking at someone with the heat of certainty and deciding, deliberately, to test them. That was not her intent when she decided to defer the disclosure. She wanted to find out whether there was affection in Derek that was not bartered. The prenup was a safeguard for a life she was not willing to give up at the first misunderstanding. It would later be used as the instrument she was forced to sign at the table, and in both moments the paper would feel to her like the hinge of a door. After the prenup, the courtship unfurled into marriage with a kind of soft insistence. The wedding was small by Ashford standards, particularly because Viven wanted a subdued ceremony among friends and a handful of relatives. She painted the ceremony bouquet herself. She refused the idea of a dress that swallowed her. Derek's family accepted the smaller guest list with a reserve that smelled faintly of disapproval, but otherwise the day shimmered in uncomplicated joy. For a while, marriage was simply the two of them learning each other's rhythms. Where the toothpaste tube was kept, which of Derek's shirts needed the most urgent mending, an early habit of pressing a hand to the small of the other's back in public as if to claim a corner of the light. Then the dinners began. Sunday belonged to the family. Sunday was when the Ashfords demonstrated their cohesion, their ability to make the world wait and admire their order. It was where Viven learned the economy of thin jabs, how a phrase flung like a napkin could be retrieved as a jest if necessary, but left as a wound if someone wanted to see how it bled. They cast about for intimations of weakness. Perhaps because she refused to be dazzled by their name, they found reason to disclaim her worth. On birthdays they gave gifts that required evaluation. On anniversaries they held small trials disguised as compliments. Derek grew quieter in those rooms. It was not malicious at first. He seemed to believe that silence stitched together a difficult fabric. Later she would recognize the shape of passivity, the kind that lets a wedge of cruelty be driven by omission rather than comment. At dinner one night, Trevor made a joke about artists being scattershot with their money, and laughter like a net followed. Viven smiled because she had to, and Derek did not offer more than a nod. On another evening, Gabriella remarked with sugary pity that a woman in Viven's position must find negotiation exhausting. She mispronounced Viven's last name in a way meant to soften the sentence into contempt. The more the jabs accumulated, the less interested Derek seemed in illuminating them. He apologized in private. Soft words said over their bed, hands pressed into the small of her back, but he stopped challenging his family's assumptions. When she would later accuse him of being complicit, he would say that the dynamics were ancient, and that blunt confrontation was not always the bridge one should try to build. He believed in appeasement. She believed in names that held meaning. Behind the domestic scenes, Viven moved in corridors of responsibility the family never imagined. Her life as a princess in hiding gave her advantages that she used in disciplined silence: a private office that handled philanthropic initiatives, a small group of fiduciaries who managed her investments, and a network of advisors who existed to translate her intent into legal reality. Diana Foster was her CFO, the kind of woman who could lay out 9 scenarios before breakfast and then fix the one that fractured the others. Jonathan Pierce ran operations like a conductor with a whip of velvet. He was implacable and discreet. James Crawford, her attorney, read contracts like sermons and had a way of finding loopholes that preserved dignity rather than exposed fault lines. They were the people who watched the slow unspooling of Sterling's balance sheet with the same hardness Viven used when a painting refused to hold its layers. Quarterly reports were a map of small losses that cumulated into imminent collapse. A failed drug trial, a CEO who preferred public relations over product development, a chain of pricey acquisitions that had not been integrated. Viven watched as a company made brittle by hubris began to fracture. She began to check in more often. Diana called her with memos at odd hours. Jonathan sent redacted board minutes that read like a family's argument about whether to fix a teacup or replace the entire set. The numbers were honest in a way conversation was not. Revenue sliding, margins narrowing, creditors circling. Viven's trust meetings were short and clinical. They spoke of capitalization and the troubled company's need for liquidity. She could have called any number of her public foundations and arranged the sort of bailouts the press loves. Grand statements of rescue and philanthropy. Instead, she thought of the people who would lose more than shareholders. The 400 strangers whose payrolls were at risk, the lab technicians whose rent would be due, the interns counting semesters until they could afford to buy groceries again. You do not keep a title as an ornament and then avoid using it in the one moment it might protect people. But she also wanted to be certain. She had practiced humility for a long time to see if love would stick without it. She wanted the company, and especially the family that had mocked quiet investors, to be tested by their own assumptions about kindness. So she designed an intervention that was surgical and, in its own way, merciful. The vehicle for it would be a private investment channel set up within the structures she controlled. V. Hartwell Capital was a name that would not appear in glossy magazines. It was the legal shell of a family office whose faces were faceless by design. The capital itself was hers, money made from decades of family holdings and investments, curated by trustees who were as loyal to principle as they were to secrecy. There would be no overt fanfare, no red ribbon, no photographers waiting on the driveway. The transfer would be professional, executed with the same precision her paintings demanded. The structure of the offer was simple but deliberate. A $100 million infusion in exchange for a structured equity stake and governance conditions that included accelerated liquidity should the company demonstrate bad faith behavior toward its investors. It was a binding contract with clear metrics, a set of performance covenants, the appointment of a non-voting observer to the board, and an arbitration clause anchored in a jurisdiction mutually recognized by both parties. The clause that would sting them later, the $1,000 monthly clause, was annexed as a conscience check. She did not design the clause as a trap. It was, on paper, almost absurdly small relative to the scale of the investment. The company would agree to process, within 48 hours, any request by the named investor for a monthly stipend of $1,000, whether payable to the investor, to a nominated charitable beneficiary, or to an employee nominated at random through the company's own HR lottery. The reason was explicit in its legalese. The investor wanted to ensure that the systems meant to honor the common man, or the common employee, were functioning, and that the people responsible for executing small, ordinary acts of decency still treated requests with respect, regardless of the requester's perceived social capital. James liked the clause for its elegance. "It's a test," he said, folding the contract under the light as if it were a map. "If your investor calls and needs $1,000 sent to a janitor because their daughter is sick and the company jumps through the hoops, then what? You have integrity. If they belittle the request or ignore it, you have proof of bad faith." Diana, who had the rawness of a woman who had always had to justify numbers, loved that too. "People always treat the small things as trivial," she said. "If they treat the trivial as contemptible, they'll treat the people as disposable." They outlined how the anonymity would be preserved. An intermediary trust company that held the shares in name only, a private counsel that would act as a conduit for communications, and a set of shell entities that made the flow of funds inscrutable to anyone who did not have the legal key. The transfer would be executed as a purchase of preferred equity with tailored covenants. The agreement included clear withdrawal rights triggered by demonstrable breach of good faith obligations if the company acted in a manner inconsistent with the covenants, if it knowingly and willfully misrepresented financials, or if it humiliated or otherwise treated the investor with contempt. The investor could exercise an emergency withdrawal, which would return the capital and trigger protected distributions to support the 400 employees for a set period. Those protections had to be airtight. They were hard to concoct, because the world of money respects only what you prove with paperwork. Viven met with Jonathan and James in a long, quiet room that smelled faintly of lemon oil. She made small notations asking for precise timelines. She did not rush them. She did not want any seam in the document that curiosity could pry open. When she signed the documents that would dispatch the capital, she did it with a hand steadier than she had used on any canvas. It was a professional motion now, the shaking hands of the artist gone and replaced by the measured cadence of a patron deciding the shape of aid. Her face was as blank as any courtroom witness. No one in the room said the words aloud that sat like a held breath on everyone's chest. The plan was to remain anonymous. "Why remain anonymous?" Derek asked later, when she tried to tell him in a sentence that refused to be small. They stood at the subway exit, the city wide and unimpressed beneath their feet. His hand found hers. He seemed anxious, not with the trivial nerves of a man who loves you, but with the deeper fear of someone who wanted to believe his place in your life was fixed. "Because I wanted to see who you were," she said. It was an answer that felt like both confession and accusation. "Because I wanted to know if the kindness you offered me was a function of my title." He seemed to mistrust the answer the way one mistrusts a mirror that tells an inconvenient truth. "We could have faced things together," he said. "If you'd told me. If I'd told you, the test would be meaningless," she replied. There was a hardness then, a ledger being balanced like a brush scraping across a canvas. She pressed her palm into his for one brief second and let go. He did not follow that touch inward. Instead, he wore that moment like one more unspoken proof that the world could be configured without her consent. The anonymous offer landed in the Ashford legal team the way a small weather event hits a coastline, an unexpected pressure that required immediate recalibration. To them it was salvation. The company was close to insolvency in reports that had been leaked to the wrong journalists. Creditors had begun to whisper. Boardrooms had been lit at odd hours. The offer came without a face and without parading about motives. It attached contingencies that were legal and resolvable, and it made their balance sheet whole for the present. In their conference room, the offer was a relief that tasted like fine tea. There was laughter at the table, short and brittle, that tried to mimic the sound of unburdened joy. The Ashfords practiced gratitude the way some people practice prayer, with rehearsed intonation and the occasional desire to be heard. They began to plan how the money would reopen delayed research and how they would spin the news into a narrative of resilience and stewardship. Trevor began plotting new initiatives as if money had always been the missing ingredient. Catherine called what had arrived a small miracle, with a tightness that glinted like a seam. They did not know then that the investor's terms included that incongruous little clause. The $1,000 monthly request would look, if exercised, like a test of their decency. The arbitration and withdrawal clauses would one day be the trim on which Viven hung her refusal to be ashamed. For now, they simply breathed. There was an unchoreographed week when the company's prospects brightened. The staff were allowed out of the cages of worry long enough to make plans. Derek came home more often at first, bringing news that was steady and dry, and for a brief stretch the house felt like a creature that had remembered how to exhale. They toasted in small glasses, their warm laughter skittering over the china. Viven painted more in those weeks. The blues in her work acquired depth, as if hope had layered itself between the bristles. But small cruelties have the awful habit of continuing, not because they must, but because no one in the room objects. When someone is treated with a reflex of condescension, the room takes that as its cue and obeys. It is the social gravity of a family like the Ashfords. The jokes continued. Some were thinly veiled digs about her delicate finances or the modest tastes she held so stubbornly. Derek smiled when such things passed around the table. He did not raise his voice against them. Viven sat with it, and something in her hardened like primer, drying into a surface that would not accept varnish. She watched the company through different eyes now, not as a patron, but as a possible rescuer, and cautiously, as someone who might be forced into the role she had practiced to avoid. The data was clinical, the staff memos were human. Viven thought of the lab tech she had seen at the gallery months earlier, the one who had asked her about classes for his niece. She thought of interns who had painted the corporate campus mural in exchange for mentorship. There were faces in the margins of the filings, and those faces mattered more than the prestige of any headline. One evening, she sat across from Derek in their kitchen, a pot of stew cooling between them. He told her about a staff meeting where his sister had been particularly acerbic about the sentimental portion of their philanthropy. He laughed at the memory, and there was no malice in the laugh, only the weary acceptance of a man who had been taught not to stir. He reached for her hand across the table. "I don't want us to be theater," he said. "I don't want us to be some performance your life has to accommodate." She looked at him. She remembered the way he had once admired a painting because it refused to conform and felt an old ache. "Then mean it," she said. It was a small thing, a map laid down in the negative. Mean it when they say something. Intervene. He promised he would. Promises after a while gather moss. She filed his words away the way you file a receipt, with the intention of checking them later against the ledger of behavior. In the private office of V. Hartwell Capital, the mechanics of rescue were refined until they were almost clinical acts of mercy. Jonathan drafted the equity purchase and attached the covenants in language that protected both parties and the people whose livelihoods might depend on the company's solvency. The withdrawal right for bad faith was written with a tightness that would allow for an immediate return of capital if the company pursued actions that were incompatible with the covenants. Discriminatory acts against employees, a public statement designed to denigrate shareholders, or demonstrable misrepresentation of financials that made the investment contingent on fraud. The severance protection was written into an annex, a prorated fund to support the payroll of Sterling for 3 months, earmarked for the 400 employees, to be held in a trust accessible in the event the withdrawal right was invoked, and the company had exhausted its assets. It was not theatrical. It was not vengeance. It was insurance and the least harm she could conceive to the innocent people who would otherwise fall through the cracks. Viven did not relish the idea of ruin. Still less did she want to watch innocence be punished in a family theater of cruelty. She knew how to weigh consequence against need. This was what had led her to place the clause precisely where it had to be, ambiguous enough to test the heart, specific enough to be enforceable if the heart failed. Before any of that could be used as a weapon, she had to be sure Derek would understand, should the anonymous money become part of his life. The thing about loving someone in a world of pretense is that you begin to measure their courage by the quiet acts they take when nobody asks them to be brave. She wanted to trust Derek. She wanted him to be the person who would stop the knife from being driven into another. She wanted to believe his apologies would eventually become the thing that saved him from being complicit. He was tired, like the rest of them. There were days he would come home with the exhausted politeness of a man who had held his tongue in a room where silence is the currency of favor. Viven watched him from the window of their living room as he stood, ordering his coat with the practiced hand of someone who owned the world in installments. She thought of the way any family can orchestrate a habit of ignoring, how cruelness advances by appointment and then settles in like a guest who refuses to leave. The anonymous transfer went through within the week. The news that the balance sheets were balanced came to Sterling by way of counsel and was received as the miraculous reprieve the Ashfords wanted it to be. For a moment, the house let itself be lighter. They scheduled a Thanksgiving in a private dining room as a celebration of the reprieve. Invitations were sent, people prepared speeches. They wanted to allow the public relations machine to spin a narrative about rescue and the resilience of the company, not knowing that the salvation had a nameless patron. Viven sat in her studio that night and watched the city mutter along its lit streets. She thought of the $1,000 clause with the same intimacy with which she thought of a private mistake, not a thing to be flaunted, but to be ready should the occasion require it. Beneath the calm of her decisions, an undercurrent had begun to gather speed. She would not strike at the family's ruin. She would withdraw in accordance with the law she had carefully arranged only if their behavior proved that respect was transactional to them. But she would, with legal arms, protect the people who had no vote in their private cruelty. She prepared quietly. She painted a small canvas and then another, watching how color could be a language where words often failed. There was a resilience to doing something small with conviction. That evening she painted a sky scraped with bright blue and a single line of gold down one edge, an incision that suggested modesty and an unrepentant vitality. She framed it and put it away, as if setting an offering for a future day. On the surface, everything moved toward the Thanksgiving celebration in a way that felt inevitable. The family rehearsed their toasts. Derek sounded more comfortable than he had in months, maybe because money has a way of softening conscience, or perhaps because he believed the rescue confirmed his competency. Viven watched him and felt the thin thread of love tighten and tremble. She had chosen to marry him because she had wanted to find love, not because of her name. She had signed the prenup with the quiet hope that love would be stronger than insecurity. For now, neither of those things could be known. When a small teacup in her studio slipped from the drying rack and shattered, pieces scattering like small stars over the worn wood, she thought of the way things break and how repair begins. She swept the fragments into the dustpan and wrapped them in tissue as if preserving the lesson of breakage, that sometimes things must be collected before they can be mended. She set the pieces in a drawer and locked it the way she had protected her title. Whatever the family would say that Saturday, whatever the toasts and the planned speeches, the legal architecture she had built would ensure no innocent would be left naked to fall. The calendar moved toward Thanksgiving with the same indifference with which a tide reaches a shore. Invitations were clipped into envelopes. The Ashford mansion rented itself to warm lighting and the rustle of silk. People would laugh. They would raise glasses to a nameless benefactor they had never met. Behind the scenes, Viven's people had put into place the instruments she might need to protect the workers, and James had finalized the clause language to the exact tense the courts would recognize. There was a tautness to the days, like a bowstring drawn and waiting for a purpose. She did not want spectacle. She had never wanted spectacle. She wanted instead a clean action, legal and measured. She had no appetite for humiliation that was not useful. The plan was to hold truth as one might hold a delicate remedy, to apply it only where it healed, never where it would hurt for show. The anonymous offer was both a hand and a test. Viven had decided that if the family treated the smallness of a $1,000 request with contempt, that would be the proof she needed to withdraw without apology and protect those without power. At the edge of her decision there was a clarity she had not anticipated. She had been trained to funnel her heritage, titles, privileges, the social graces, into acts of responsibility. She had hidden to know the shape of love, and the knowledge had left a bruise that had hardened into resolve. The family would be forced to measure themselves. Derek would be forced finally to prove whether he could be more than an apologetic figure in the face of his relatives' cruelty. The painting on her easel dried with the quiet of someone who has decided to do what is necessary instead of what is comfortable. That night, as leftover light thinned, she wrote a brief note to herself. Not a plan of revenge, but a ledger of intention. It read, in the exactness she favored, that care for innocence would be prioritized over the comfort of punishment, that any withdrawal would be made to protect the 400 first, and only subsequently to preserve her own dignity. It was a sentence of mercy disguised as a contract. There is an odd peace in decisions made without clamor. The world continues on its circuits of small cruelties and greater unremarked graces, but a person who finally sets the terms of their existence finds the shape of their life in the slope of a single signature. Viven signed. Then she closed the folder and carried the inked words toward a weekend that smelled, to her, like a storm gathering just beyond the glass. If you love twisty stories like this, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The house warmed into celebration a week later, chandeliers breathing light like a stage. Derek arrived early that day, smoothing his cufflinks with the certainty of a man offering proof of his composure. Eleanor presided over the preparations as if she were a conductor, and the room a single instrument that must play to her tempo. They had planned a toast for a nameless savior. Speeches were rehearsed to sound both grateful and invincible. Sterling's employees felt the lift in their paychecks and the sputter of rumor on the grapevine. The company was alive again, they told themselves, if only for a few quarters. Viven dressed in a way she had chosen to be presentable without being an ornament. Her dress was plain and honest, the kind that allows the face to speak rather than the fabric. She wore a small pin at her collar that meant only what she knew it meant, an anchor of identity, invisible to anyone who did not know to look. The house smelled of roast and the citrus of someone trying to make the air festive. Silver gleamed in a way that seemed to remind guests of the economy of presentation. They sat at a long table under an arch of polite conversation. The conversation was punctuated with the measured sounds of cutlery and the occasional forced laugh. When the speeches began, they spoke as if they had been answered by Providence. Derek raised his glass and vowed that Sterling would act with renewed humility, and that the company would repay the trust that had been placed in them. The matriarch spoke of stewardship. Trevor spoke of strategy, grounding their gratitude in future planning rather than present relief. Viven listened, and something in her saw the thin skin beneath their words. Gratitude can be an instrument of acknowledgement or an armor of convenience. She watched to see which it would be. Her pulse moved under her ribs like an unsteady bird. The $1,000 clause, tucked in legal annexes and sealed in the remote safety of secure servers, seemed to hum in the quiet of her bones as if asking for an answer the family did not yet know was due. She watched faces around the table, faces that had become skilled in making contempt look like affection. They toasted their anonymous benefactor. They had no idea she sat between them and the plate they admired. They had no idea that the person they were praising had the legal authority to withdraw the comfort of their rescue on grounds that were perfectly reasonable to the law. If the Ashfords treated the investor with contempt, that would constitute bad faith. Postcards of small things collected the hours. A laugh, the clink of china, a nephew telling a story that required no listening. At one point, a teacup trembled near Viven's elbow as someone gestured too broadly, and the ceramic hit the table with the soft, unmistakable sound of life resumed. It did not shatter. For a while, the small things were enough. Later, between dessert and the polite scatter of guests, Derek reached across the table. He pressed his fingers to her hand with the insistence of someone who needed reassurance. She remembered the promise he'd offered once years before. He pressed his fingers to her hand across the table with a tenderness that had sheltered them both on quieter nights. "I meant it," he said, low, as if lowering a curtain around a private stage. His thumb moved in small insistence over the back of her hand, smoothing imagined creases. Viven felt the pressure and learned, in that small electric moment, how much the shape of a promise could be a thing to be catalogued against behavior, how easily speech could fossilize into habit. Then Trevor laughed, unnecessarily loud, and the room returned to its practiced rhythm. Trevor's amusement carried a note that cut through the comfort of Derek's gesture, an insinuation that invited others to fish for the sharpness they kept in their pockets. Gabriella tossed an airy compliment at Viven about artsy eccentricities, the flourishes of a woman who knew how to belittle and then call it charm. Someone made a remark about the delicacy of Viven's spending, generalizing what they did not understand into a gentle condemnation. Laughter followed like chorus. Derek's hand tightened. He looked as if he were holding a bird that might beguile. For a handful of seconds he seemed to have a choice, to step into the small cruelties and dislodge them with his voice, or to let them continue and become the silent witness the family expected. He did neither as decisively as she had once hoped. Then Catherine slid a folded paper toward the center of the table as if it were a party favor. Her smile was the precise kind that maps contempt into etiquette. "We thought it would be simpler to settle things now," she said brightly. "No scandal, no drama later. Quick and clean, for everyone's peace." Derek read the paper aloud, and the words fell like a weight. It was titled, "Mutual Dissolution Agreement," in an Ashford letterhead. The language was careful and preternaturally kind. Amicable separation, mutual recognition of differing paths. But the thrust of it was unmistakable. A public dissolution of the marriage signed at the table, witnessed by the family, the terms largely favorable to the Ashfords' public narrative. There were clauses about waiving claims, confidentiality, and the mechanics of how any moral complaints would be handled privately between counsel. Viven's chest narrowed as if someone had pressed a fist into her sternum. The signatures they requested would be perfunctory legal motions in some respects, Derek's signature to give the thing life, and hers to make it visible to witnesses. The prenup would enforce the separation of premarital assets, and the confidentiality clause would ensure the story lived within a cushion of silence. To sign this document was to hand the public a version of the end they had not consented to. "Sign," Eleanor said gently, like a mother instructing a child to take medicine. Viven looked at Derek. He crumpled. A look of exhaustion stole across his face, as if years of curated restraint had finally revealed its strain. He said nothing more than, "I don't want this to be ugly," the plea of a man who feared what spectacle would do to him and his career. She could have refused. She could have announced the investment herself from that table and told them everything. She could have made them watch as the person they'd mocked took back the life they'd mismeasured. She did not choose spectacle. She chose to sign. Her signature trembled. Ink bled into the fibers. Tears blurred the letters she made as if grief wanted to make the strokes illegible. She signed because, for that fragile, brittle moment, she wanted to spare Derek an escalation he appeared not to be able to contain. She signed because the alternative would be a judicial war that would leak and grind and possibly hollow out the very protections she had built to shelter the innocent. She signed because her instinct, practical, protective, measured harm, and chose the lesser part. When her pen left the paper, she felt, briefly, a splitting, shame on one side and a sharp resolve on the other. The room applauded with the kind of relief that sounds like pre-planned applause. Someone rose to fill the silence with a toast. Glasses rang. The murmured relief of the family folded back into music. Viven kept her face steady. She listened to the cheers with the same measured distance she felt watching a painting's first layer dry. Underneath her grief, a legal mechanism that had been drafted in cold light of day unfurled its careful machinery. She had not brought the thunder into the room. She would not need it. The instrument would be the letter she sent with the casual precision of someone making an appointment. She waited for the moment the laughter softened, then slid her phone from the inner pocket of her dress. The world around her narrowed to the glass and to the small keys she knew by muscle. James had taught her the legal cadence of dispatches. Jonathan had rehearsed the practical texture of a walk-in. She typed 3 short sentences, staid commands, the language her team would recognize instantly. Withdraw investment under Clause 13B, material bad faith, humiliatory act toward named investor, redeem preferred equity, activate V, Hartwell Severance Trust, for 3 months payroll for all current employees, immediate notice to Sterling Council, deliver via trusted intermediary now. She hit send. The phone hummed, then was still. Her fingers smelled faintly of citrus from the earlier sauce. Her tears dried, leaving a salt trace on her cheeks. Minutes later, as Derek rose to fetch the next bottle of wine, the front door of the dining room opened with a soft, precise sound. It was not the rattle of casual arrival. It was the measured entry of people who traveled to rooms with the purpose of being seen and being precise. Jonathan Pierce walked in first, his suit perfectly tailored, an envelope clutched in his hand. Diana Foster followed, expression unreadable, carrying a small leather folio. Behind them, James Crawford moved with the calm of someone who knew how to read a room and reorder it. They had not come as an army. They needed only presence, legal notice, and proof. They walked slowly to the head of the table. Viven rose as soon as they approached. One turned a face toward her, and for a beat the room read nothing. There was no flourish, no drum roll. Just the soft click of a briefcase and the way the light fell differently when someone crossed into ownership of a moment. Jonathan set the envelope on the table and opened it. He did not speak at once. He placed a copy of the investment agreement on the wood between them, the pages fanned with the same precision she used to show a collector a study. Viven felt the eyes on the white paper as if a microscope had been trained on her life. "This is a formal notice," Jonathan said, voice even. "On behalf of V. Hartwell Capital and at the direction of the investor, we are exercising the emergency redemption clause provided in the equity purchase agreement executed on behalf of Sterling Pharmaceuticals on October 3rd. We hereby demand repurchase of the preferred shares pursuant to Section 7(4), and we are activating the attached severance trust agreement to provide payroll funding for the 400 current employees for a period of 90 days, pending liquidation of the investment." He slid an additional sheet across the table. It was a technical instruction, a bank routing of an existing standby facility, the trust account number, the calculation of the monthly payroll allocation, and the legal basis for the action. The bad faith clause they had all read but never imagined would be triggered by a family dinner. Trevor's face went a color out of range. Catherine's smile faltered. Derek looked as if someone had told him how to breathe wrong. For a few seconds the room was a theater where everyone held a frozen gesture. Then Trevor spoke, raised and angry. "You can't just— This is grandstanding. That instrument isn't meant to be used to bully families." "It is not grandstanding," James said quietly, sliding the annex toward Trevor. "It is a contractual right with clear triggers. The agreement allows for immediate redemption in the event of willful and public humiliation of the investor, language delineated and agreed upon by counsel on both sides. The legal instructions are compliant. If Sterling cannot effect the repurchase within the agreed window, that is a corporate reality. We are not here to punish. We are here to remit payroll and protect employees." "No one humiliated an investor," Trevor protested. "You are calling this humiliation because of feelings. This table was not an investment forum." Jonathan's look rested on Trevor like an appraisal that could not be bargained with. "The clause is not subjective. It refers to public acts of contempt directed at or purporting to diminish the standing of the investor. Presenting this dissolution publicly and in the context of denigrating the investor's character while praising the nameless savior elsewhere satisfies the clause's threshold. Counsel will arbitrate if you wish, but the redemption right is a trigger event the investor may exercise immediately." Eleanor put a hand to her mouth. The sound of crystal being set down echoed as if someone had dropped a commandment. For a family that had always fed off the movement of social currency, the floor had shifted. "Who is this?" someone demanded finally, voice small with the shock of dawning knowledge. "Who are you representing?" Jonathan looked at Viven with the gentleness of a conductor about to cue a note. He inclined, an infinitesimal, formal motion, and the phrase, when it came, jarred the air. "Her Royal Highness Princess Vivian of Erwin." The room drew a breath. It was not a decree. He had not put a crown on the table. Nobody had unfurled a charter. He had named a person. The title landed in the hush and made them reconsider their privileges for the first time that night. Some guests paled, others began to whisper. Derek's hand left the back of Viven's chair and slid to his face. For a moment he looked as if he might rise and oppose the intrusion. He did not. Viven felt an odd mix of exposure and exoneration. The title was only the shape of a thing she had always known. It was not a magic wand. It was an identity that furnished legal access to resources she had arranged precisely for that contingency. It had been a private lever held quietly until needed. The retinue's naming of her was a mild scandal for their world and a coup for her purpose. A private person choosing to exercise private resources to protect private people. People murmured that she had lied. They called it deception. Other voices, the ones that had spent years congealing into a chorus around Ashford's certainty, started to reform into a new, ragged sound. Gabriella asked, with a kind of pale fury, why she would hide such a thing. "Why hide from us if you were going to—" "Because I wanted to know what honor looked like without a bow in front of it," Viven said. Her voice had a new edge, not cruelty, but a quiet, resolute steel. "You toasted a nameless savior tonight. You have a right to decide if you meant it. The document you asked me to sign was an attempt to make private the humiliation you inflicted on me in public. That attempt is part of why I am withdrawing." She kept her face simple. She did not lift the title into a weapon. She described no vengeance. She explained what had been done in the language of law. The company had been offered capital under covenants. The investor had reserved remedies for bad faith acts, and the present acts constituted a trigger event. She asked, with no triumph in her tone, that the severance trust be respected. The words had the effect of a coin dropped into still water. Ripples radiated. The Ashfords grasped at procedural objections. "This will ruin people," Eleanor said, not in accusation but in the real fear of consequence, of jobs, of reputations, of the future they had planned like a ledger. "Then we will protect them," Diana said, flat and steady. She reached toward the folder and pushed the severance calculations forward. 3 months. Payroll for the current 400. Placement programs to follow. Temporary housing funds where needed. The trust is funded by a standby credit facility arranged by V. Hartwell Capital and will begin disbursement at the end of this banking day. No one applauded. Relief was not an easy thing to survive when the instruments of one's life were under reconsideration. The employees were spared immediate falling into the street. The company faced the prospect of having to repay capital or else see its balance sheet collapse. That was the legal hinge Viven had set when she drafted the agreement months before. Humane protection for the vulnerable, structural consequence for the negligent. They called lawyers. Papers were exchanged. Trevor argued for a negotiation. Derek tried to make a case for his family. The Ashfords' counsel inspected the notice and, after a brief conference that smelled of stale coffee and legal anxiety, admitted that the documents were legally coherent. They proposed arbitration as counsel would. James agreed. But the arbitration included the immediate redemption remedy if the company could not fund the repurchase within the agreed window, 72 hours by contract. That was not a lot of time for a company with stretched liquidity. The room deflated in slow increments. The Ashfords' faces, so used to arranging rooms like chessboards, sat in a new script where their moves required explanation rather than assertion. Derek's mouth trembled as if words could shape happiness the way clay does. He said nothing coherent after that for several minutes. Viven watched him with the same deliberate attention she used when a painting refuses to find its meaning. She felt sadness for him, real, not rhetorical, and recognition of her own part in the string of choices they'd made together. Outside the dining room, phones began to signal. People texted and called. The news, once pried from the private, becomes its own gravity. By the time the first guest left that night, the story was no longer merely a family matter. Journalists had smelled the scandal and began to probe. Sterling's creditors, who had watched the company's short-term liquidity with the appetite of a predator, were suddenly awake. In the days that followed, the kitchen of the Ashford house, formerly a theater of practiced domesticity, took on the cadence of crisis management. Sterling's board convened emergency sessions. Trevor paced. Counsel drafted responses. Investors who had been reassured 1 week prior now demanded clarity. The redemption notice had a legal bite. The company had to either repurchase or find alternate funding. They could not both remain aloof from the moral consequences and also keep the capital whose presence had been predicated on a set of covenants. The press, in its slower, nastier ways, found the odd chink in the Ashfords' armor. The story of the nameless patron who had saved them only to reveal herself in the manner of a personal injury. Rumors rippled. The headline writers imagined motives, revenge, ego, political statement, none of which matched the clinical truth that Viven had tried to make. A protective action, a proportional consequence, and a fund for employees. Sensationalism blurred the edges. Sterling attempted to place a call to V. Hartwell Capital to negotiate. The intermediary trust returned the call with the litany of formalities. The company's offer was insufficient to satisfy the contractual redemption demands. Trevor made the attempt to marshal assets. He could not produce, within the 72-hour window, the liquidity required. The board then had to inform creditors. A cascade of letters ensued, and within a week, faced with a legal repurchase demand and dwindling cash, Sterling filed for bankruptcy protection. It was a technical, procedural event, a company's legal status when the architecture of capital changes under legally defined pressure. It was not theatrical. It was consequence. Employees watched the filing with a strange, brutal geometry, fear and relief braided together. The severance trust began to disburse according to the schedule Diana had outlined, direct deposit set to cover 3 months of payroll. The funds were anonymous in the sense that the staff did not know who had underwritten the trust. The money arrived as a trust distribution administered by an independent fiduciary. The human things, the rent paid on time, the lab tech who could finish her experiments, the intern who could eat without worry, happened because someone had structured the means. Viven did not sit at home to watch the ruin. Her time became a series of methodical calls and small, practical measures. She coordinated with Diana to ensure the severance disbursements were efficient. She spoke quietly with Jonathan about the ethical steps necessary for private donors to avoid becoming public punching bags. She instructed James to ensure the trust's anonymity for beneficiaries remained ironclad. She made discreet calls to small community organizations to prepare for potential layoffs and to design placement seminars for the workers. She did not want to be admired. She wanted to be useful. Derek called her and left messages that moved between grief and anger. At times he sounded contrite, at others offended. He was, in every sense, a man torn between the family whose orbit had defined him and the woman who had asked to be loved for her voice rather than the halo that sometimes followed her. They met once after the dust had begun to settle, in a quiet cafe where the air smelled of old coffee and the hum of a city that had not been asked for permission to watch them untangle. He tried to explain himself. "I wanted to protect you from the spectacle," he said. They said many things." She interrupted, not unkindly. "You folded. You made a choice to preserve the feeling of peace in that room at the cost of allowing cruelty a stage. There is a difference between protection and silence." He looked as if the sentence hurt him in the way an honest thing does. He reached then, for the first time without the trappings of family ritual, toward the shape of a real apology, but his apology foundered on what he had not yet learned how to bear, publicly acknowledging fault where silence had always seemed to be comfort. They finalized the divorce through counsel more than court. Signatures exchanged in lawyers' offices, sealed documents, a procedural reading of a finality that felt legal rather than theatrical. The prenup performed precisely as intended. Premarital assets were held in a blind trust. Viven's titles and funds were insulated from marital claim. The dissolution was brief and civil, only as messy as the facts demanded. She left the marriage intact in her memory as a genuine affection, marred by the ways that family dynamics had eroded the shared ground they now tried to replant elsewhere. Media interest rose like smoke. Interviewers wanted the story about the princess who had hidden among artists. Social feeds divided into uncharitable camps. Viven refused to meet microphones. She would not let the story be turned into a spectacle of moral aesthetics. She issued a single written statement through James. The severance trust had been activated to protect employees, and while she regretted the hurt done in private lives, she would not participate in a public game of accusation. The response, short, quiet, annoyingly dignified, was not viral. It did not need to be. The practical aftermath moved like a number of small machines working in concert. The bankruptcy court assigned trustees, assets were identified and appraised. The trust Diana had set up covered payroll for the initial 90 days, funds wired by a standby facility, underwritten by a private capital arrangement Viven had secured months earlier in anticipation of the very contingency she now faced. The funds were designed to be a buffer, not a cure for systemic corporate failure, but a human heart in a mechanical world. As Sterling's affairs unspooled, the Ashford social world shifted under their feet. Their philanthropic partners re-examined ties. Board seats were relitigated. Sponsors withdrew with polite notes. The family found its way out of the public glare with varying degrees of grace. Some attempted contrition, others doubled down on indignation. There was no delight in watching them stumble. Viven's sense of satisfaction, such as it was a quiet calibration, an affirmation that structures built with ethical intention could alter harms without celebrating the collapse of individuals. Eleanor wrote a letter before the season turned. It arrived in a plain envelope left at Viven's studio one morning by a courier who refused to divulge origin. The handwriting on the page was the same that had once mapped menus and guest lists. Now it was a hand that trembled with admission. Her words were an old woman's inventory, apologies, regrets, and the melancholic catalogue of things she had not understood until she no longer had the reflexes to defend them. She wrote of how power had ossified into habit in their family, and how habit had blindfolded them to the small cruelties they had performed as a matter of routine. She asked for forgiveness in a way that was not coy or performative. She asked and then, with a humility that was almost novel in such a life, told Viven that she would understand if it were not given. Viven read the letter twice, 3 times. She folded it and placed it in a drawer. There was no grand reconciliation. There was a small, tempered mercy. The letter would be kept as evidence of a mind changed, perhaps too late, perhaps in time. She did not write back. She set the paper beside a small jar of brushes, beside a card from one of her students, who had written about how art had shown them they were capable of something more than anyone had told them. The months that followed were an orchestration of small, decisive acts. Viven opened her studio to more than herself. She leased an old warehouse on the city's riverfront and spent the initial quiet days fixing its roof and scrubbed floors. She painted larger works, ones that were not exhibitions, but vessels for the kind of teaching she wanted to give. She called in favors from artists who had once taught with her, and from local organizations who ran after-school programs in neighborhoods that had little in the way of resources. The space became a place of making and of patching, the honest work of people who mended community by lending time and paint and attention. She established the V. Hartwell Community Studio as a non-profit entity, not because she wanted press. Indeed, she turned down a number of televised interviews offering her a platform in exchange for a certain kind of story, but because she wanted permanence. The studio offered free classes for teenagers, paid apprenticeships for those who showed a hunger to learn, and a small stipend for families who needed it. She launched, quietly, a mentorship initiative that paired senior technicians from the now dismantled labs with interns and early career students, bridging the gap between lost jobs and new skills. The Severance Trust had been intended to be a temporary bridge. The studio was designed to be a durable foothold. There were people who came with their wounds and left with pain on their hands, and a sense that waking up in the morning could mean making something instead of worrying about the next bill. They were not cured. No one had promised miracles. They learned to mix a color, to scrub a canvas, to frame a small success as its own kind of currency. Viven found that teaching had its own hum, the corrective rhythm of instructing fingers not to grip too tight, of telling someone to smear color boldly across their fear. The studio grew, slowly, into an ordinary theater of ordinary bravery. Occasionally, a reporter would press for an on-camera confession. She declined. Her privacy was not a shield for pride. It was a deliberate choice not to permit the intimacy of her life to become the headline of somebody else's entertainment. She allowed 2 carefully arranged written profiles, both focused on the apprenticeships and the ways in which the studio was grafting new skills into people who had been at risk of losing them. The public response was modest and warm. Donations came from small pockets, not from the tabloids that would have made her a character in a better-selling edition. She preferred the smallness. It suited the work. Legal matters, too, moved through their motions. Arbitration confirmed the contractual terms. The redemption was upheld as lawful, given the constructions and the sequence of actions. Sterling's liquidation followed the formalities of corporate insolvency. There were hearings and filings and the kind of administrative sorrow that leaves people filing claims for pensions and owed wages. Viven's role in the matter remained, by her explicit instruction, functional rather than theatrical. The trust disbursed, placement programs were funded, and a portion of the recovered assets were directed toward a job placement initiative run through her studio and a network of local employers. There was, in the weeks that followed, a quiet reckoning among some of the Ashfords. Embarrassment traveled where shame could not. Remorse, which looks like apology, but is more often a slow recognition of one's role in the harm of others, arrived in uneven doses. Eleanor's letter was one of the rarer honest things. Other apologies were proffered in conversations that required negotiation and were sometimes sincere. The family's public narrative shifted from triumph to caution. They would not, overnight, be re-educated into gentleness, but they had been made to face consequences. Viven, for her part, did not dwell on their ruin. She had never wanted that. Her satisfaction was not the kind that aired itself in gloating. It was a measured knowledge that the instruments she had arranged to protect innocent people had worked precisely as they were conceived. She thought often of the lab tech whose niece had received a scholarship from the small fund she had sponsored. She thought of the interns who could afford groceries for a term. She thought of the way a child's face lights when they finally mix a color that matches the sky. Those were the things that mattered. On a soft evening months later, when the gutters down the street shone with rain and the city's lights reflected like scattered jewels, Viven stood in the doorway of her studio as children washed brushes in a sink. One of them, a girl with a fierce set to her chin, pulled a towel over her hands and looked up at Viven with paint under her fingernails. "Miss Viv," she said, using the name everyone had decided on because it was kinder to her privacy. "Do you ever get lonely when you hide?" Viven looked at the girl's earnest face. She had learned to answer difficult questions with straightforwardness instead of parable. "Sometimes," she said. "But being honest about what you can do for people seems to keep that loneliness small." The girl's eyes went wide, like someone discovering a shape in clouds. They returned to their work, and Viven watched the small acts of creation as if they were a map out of the last months. The studio smelled of paint, hot tea, and the faint lemon oil she favored for cleaning brushes. It was nothing like a palace and everything like home. She had been offered, quietly, by a few well-intentioned journalists, the chance to do a profile that would center her title, the princess who had walked among painters. She refused. There was an appetite in the world for fairy endings, and she would not hand it one. Her privacy, she had discovered, functioned as a kind of altar, not to secrecy for its own sake, but to a life that chose usefulness over spectacle. One day she received a small parcel in the post, a teacup, repaired in the tradition she loved, its crack mended with gold, the circle of the healed line glittering like a seam. The note was unsigned. She placed the cup on her sill and for a moment remembered the moment a teacup had fallen in her studio months before and how she had kept its shards. The mended vessel was a quiet emblem of the work of repair. In the evenings, she painted. She painted skies and the hands that held them, hands with knuckles worn from labor, hands with ink from writing letter campaigns, hands smudged with the color of repair. Her canvases were not created for the market so much as they were archives of attention, records of where she had put her care. Visitors to the studio were asked to leave their phones in a basket at the door. They were invited to be present. The finality of the marriage, the legal choreography, the Ashfords' fall from comfort, all these things receded into the background of a life she no longer chose to constrict around them. She had reclaimed her name in a different register, not as a signet that demanded kowtowing, but as a responsibility she carried into deeds. She was a princess in title, a patron in practice, and an artist in the way she ordered days, with the patience of those who know pigment must dry before a varnish can be trusted. On an ordinary morning, she opened the studio to a class of teenagers whose faces were bright with the odd hope of those discovering a world they had not been instructed to own. They painted roughly at first, then with more faith. One boy mixed a blue so close to the exact color she loved that she felt the old ache of recognition and let it sit with him as he widened his brush. He looked up at her and grinned. Later, as the light in the studio thinned into late gold, she made tea and found herself standing at the window of the small penthouse she retained, a quiet space with a view of the river and the city that had witnessed most of her decisions. She poured a cup and raised it to herself in a gesture that no camera would ever see. "To new beginnings," she said under her breath. The toast was private, not triumphant. It contained in its smallness everything: the protection of innocence, the refusal to trade dignity for spectacle, the choice to build rather than to raise. She sat for a long while watching the river take its courses. The life she had chosen, public for the good deeds, private for the wounds, felt like a canvas slowly unrolling. She would teach, she would protect, she would refuse cheap vindication. The title she carried was a piece of her history, not a script for someone else to write. She had stopped hiding because hiding had become a form of silence that allowed cruelty to proceed. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an old student thanking her for a scholarship. She smiled and typed a quick reply. Then she set the phone down, the screen dark, and walked to the table where a small framed letter Eleanor had written sat quietly in a drawer. She took it out, smoothed the paper with 2 fingers, then closed the drawer again. Understanding did not obligate forgiveness, but it made space for motion when motion was needed. She had, at last, refused to make her life available for a spectacle of correction. The drama had unfolded. The instruments she had designed had done the work they were meant to do. What remained was the quieter, more ordinary work of making opportunities for others. And in that, perhaps, her real crown, if crown it was, sat most comfortably. Like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic stories. Comment what you would have done in Viven's place.